And this is, I think, what explains the rivalry between a permission understanding of toleration and a respect understanding of toleration in our time, in the conflicts of our societies. So come back to the crucifix example. Here, the advocates of a permission conception of toleration took the view that although religious minorities should be granted freedom from coercion and freedom of conscience in principle, there was no obligation to grant them legal and political equality such that their objection could have had the effect of preventing the Christian majority among the citizenry from expressing, as it was called in German legal language, their positive religious freedom by affixing their symbols by law in the classrooms of public schools. Toleration of dissenters meant not proselytizing them, but they in turn were it's just very difficult. But they in turn were expected to exhibit an entirely different kind of toleration, namely recognizing the dominance of the majority. But from the perspective of the other, the respect conception, that was impermissible. This turns the democratic function of freedom of religion on its head. For the latter requires that central social institutions should be neutral in religious matters, disregarding the distribution between majority and minorities. So they argued for having the crucifixes removed because it was the symbol of one faith, and it shouldn't be there by law. And that's finally what the German Constitutional Court decided, and it caused quite a stir in Germany generally, and especially some parts of Germany. Now, in the case of the headscarf controversy, it seems sufficient from the perspective of a permission toleration to permit a Muslim teacher to practice her occupation on the condition that she forgoes wearing a conspicuous religious symbol that unavoidably affects the school children negatively. It is argued that, regardless of the teacher's motives, this symbol exercises a religious influence over children, especially over girls, from Muslim families, which is not compatible with a democratic society. On the other hand, making such a sweeping judgment and stigmatizing a religion without regard to the individual case from the perspective of the respect conception seems unjustified and seems to be impermissible. And that is indeed what the German Constitutional Court ruled just 2 months ago in a recent decision. Mutual respect among citizens means tolerating each other in their different ethical and cultural identities according to the respect conception, and scrutinizing valid laws and regulations to determine whether they measure up to the claim to equal respect or whether they discriminate against strange or foreign or minority forms of life and expose them to a general suspicion. Now, the defenders of the ban on headscarves thought they could use the neutrality argument from the crucifix case to argue against the headscarves of teachers. But of course, they overlooked that it's a difference whether a religious symbol is put up in a classroom by law or whether a teacher as an individual decides to carry and wear a religious symbol. That's not a minor difference. So they could not use the neutrality argument, even though they tried. But you see the difference of a permission thinking of toleration, where a majority defines the major form of life and institutions, and then decides to which extent minorities ought to be tolerated. Now, third example, it's sufficient from the perspective of permission toleration not to prohibit or openly discriminate against ways of life involving same-sex partnerships, but in that view, equal treatment in central institutions as marriage is not called for. The claim is that these institutions rest upon the evaluative convictions of the overwhelming majority of citizens, and these are not subject to negotiation on arbitrary grounds. From the perspective of the respect conception, however, equality of legal status is required insofar as the rights of others are not thereby impaired and it's not clear how they would in such cases. So you see again the rivalry between the permission and the respect conception. Now, it is important to see, as I was trying to argue, that the concept of toleration itself does not tell us whether the permission usage or the respect usage is the right one, because they both equally are part of the long history of toleration. So when we criticize the permission conception and argue for the respect conception, as we might want to do, and I argue should in a democratic society, we need other resources to use to argue for the respect conception. And I think it is useful at that point to remind ourselves that the basic question of toleration really is a question of justice. It is a question of which norms and regulations and institutions can justly be imposed on a plurality of citizens where they disagree about important aspects of the right way to live, and where a majority, even if it is a majority, might not have the legitimate power or be in a legitimate position to impose their view of life on a minority. Norms that bestow or restrict liberties, such as whether you can be a teacher if you are a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf. These are not minor issues because, in a university like Frankfurt, we have a number of female Muslim students, like I'm sure at the University of Washington you have too, and in many other teachers' colleges. I'm not sure how the education of teacher is arranged here in the state of Washington, but in German universities they just go through the regular university. So you have a lot of these students, and if the laws do not change, they will be able to get their degree, but they will not be able to work if they do not leave the headscarf away, which for many of them is really a problem. So it's not a minor issue that we're talking about. It's an issue of justice. When are we justified of imposing such restrictions on others? The norms that can justify such restrictions or such liberties have to be reciprocally and generally justifiable. Reciprocity means that one cannot refuse to grant another person certain demands or liberties that one takes granted for oneself, and that one must not assume that others share one's evaluative conceptions and interests, not even by appeal to, and especially not by appeal to higher truths, religious truths and convictions, which are precisely not shared. Generality means that all of those subjected to such norms must be able in principle to share the reasons for regulations governing the realm of toleration and freedom that can be legitimized in general terms. Toleration in this sense is a virtue of justice because it is founded on a principle of the justification of norms that treat all as free and equal, and therefore also respect the different identities of persons. Thus understood, the virtue of tolerance as a democratic virtue of justice has two components: one normative about what you ought to do, and one epistemic about what you ought to think about the beliefs of others and yourself. Let me explain briefly. I'll be done in a minute. Bill said I shouldn't speak for longer than 2 hours, so I'd just be a little over time. The normative component consists in recognizing what I call the basic right to justification in contexts of justice, which is a right that implies a duty of reciprocal and general justification. Being tolerant means that when one's reasons for or against a specific regulation are not sufficient to satisfy the criteria of reciprocity and generality, I have to recognize that my convictions fall short of justifying a general norm, even though I can hold these convictions about what is proper in terms of, a religious way of life. It means to recognize that one's ethical position encounters other ethical positions that I might still believe are problematic or wrong, but are still not unreasonable to hold or immoral to hold. So I have to understand that my objections against a certain way of life, are good enough for my view of what the good life is, but they're not good enough to impose a restriction on that other way of life. Many people in Germany are not happy by the traditionally Christian cities to have huge minarets in the silhouette of such a city. So not that they have to be happy about it, but they have to understand that in a just society, that's just what's going to happen if you have a number of Muslim citizens living in that society. So that is where toleration is called for. And it's called for by justice, because it would be unjust to reserve the right to build religious buildings just for one group. So this points to the second component, and in the history of toleration that has been long fought over. And the question here is, what kind of self-relativization, I'm sorry, that's a clumsy term pronounced by a clumsy German, what kind of restraint on my own beliefs is necessary for me to be tolerant in that way? Reasonable persons, according to the respect conception, not only recognize their duty to justify the norms that they think should apply to all, but also to recognize that ethical conflicts of the good can arise between positions that, even though not irrational, may be neither verifiable nor falsifiable in purely rational terms. That is what Rawls called reasonable disagreements. These are disagreements which are irresolvable by reason, but still do not mean that one or the other party is irrational or unreasonable. Reason is finite with respect to religious issues and a number of other issues about what the best way of life is. Reason can demarcate when certain answers to the good life are irrational, but it leaves a big room of reasonable disagreement about answers to the good life. If I recognize this, that doesn't mean that my answer to the good life is, less founded or less grounded. I just have to know that others can come up with different answers. In the history of reflection on religion, it was a major move to understand that religion is a sphere of beliefs, or marks a sphere of beliefs that are reasonable to hold and also reasonable to reject. That faith is what grounds religious beliefs and not knowledge that can be proven to be true or false. And there are some heroes in the history of toleration, like Pierre Bayle, a Huguenot philosopher, who were very clear on drawing that distinction. That if you allow for a plurality of religious answers of faith to questions of the good life, you need not believe that every answer is as good as the other. You can still think that your belief, your faith, is superior to the others, and you can debate it, but it is still in the realm of faith that you have that debate. And ultimately, you have to understand that what draws others to other beliefs, which you think are a little bogus, is faith. And that, you can have lots of arguments with them, but at a certain point, that is something that guides them is not reducible to rational argument. It's also not irrational. It's what Bayle called dessus de la raison. It's beyond reason. It's not irrational, but something more than that. Now, to come back to my paradoxes, such a view of toleration should be able to resolve the paradoxes of toleration. Remember the first paradox of the tolerant racist. And we ask, yes, racism is a terrible form of intolerance, one of the worst. Is tolerance the right reaction here? And the answer is no. Tolerance is not always the right response to intolerance. Sometimes the objection itself, that someone has a racist objection against others and aversion, is not a reason to ask him or her to be tolerant, but to give up the objection, to no longer hold that objection. Because, remember, in a toleration scheme, the objection component is preserved. The Catholic who tolerates the Protestant remains a Catholic and finds reasons to tolerate the Protestant. But that doesn't put doubt on his Catholicism. The tolerant racist, thus, would remain a racist. He would just not act on his or her beliefs. But that's a problem. We don't want, in a society, tolerant racists. Well, it might be better to have tolerant racists than intolerant racists, but really what we should argue for is that this objection, which falls into a category of racism, disappears. In the history of toleration, many Enlightenment thinkers thought that indeed, if religious intolerance is a problem, religion is the problem. So you should do away with religion. That's the solution. Well, that proved a little, problematic, and it turned out otherwise. So not every objection is a problem. The finitude of reason asks us to recognize the plurality of answers to the question of the good life. But some objections are a problem, and they should be addressed. So a racist should be asked to overcome his racist objections and not be asked to be tolerant. He should not be tolerant, but no longer be a racist. The case of homosexuality is structurally similar. We would hope that homophobia and objections to homosexual forms of life would disappear, and that it would no longer be an issue of toleration. Still, it is better to have same-sex partnerships tolerated than not tolerated, but eventually the objection should disappear. The second paradox, that of moral toleration, remember, asks how can it be morally right to tolerate what is morally wrong? Now, it cannot be right. If a practice is seriously morally wrong, such that it violates the equality and freedom of human beings, it ought not to be tolerated. What ought to be tolerated are the many forms of life with which you might have an ethical disagreement because you have a different answer and view of what the good life is, but still within a framework of morality that we both share. So we have to make, and that is an important development in the history of toleration, we have to be able to make a distinction in our normative vocabulary between the norms we think no one can reasonably reject, and everyone is bound to, and the many norms of values which are important in our lives, but which not everyone has to accept and has to follow in his or her social or personal life. That distinction is sometimes hard to make when it comes to difficult issues, but that's what toleration asks us. It asks us, well, even though some values are very dear to you, can you really say that everyone ought to accept them and follow them? And can the ways of life which don't really be considered to be immoral? The final paradox of drawing the limits would be avoided if the reasons for marking the limits of toleration themselves took their orientation from the principle of democratic respect. And so if we draw the limits where practices violate the basic norms of equal democratic and moral respect, that drawing of the limits should not be called an act of intolerance. That should be called a justifiable act of drawing the limits of toleration, because otherwise toleration is always intolerance, and that paradox we should avoid. So toleration has its limits, but if they are justifiably drawn, that drawing the limits is not intolerant in a problematic way. It just marks the limits of what can be accepted between free and equal persons. I think such a scheme of toleration provides us with norms and duties and rights that majorities and minorities alike ought to, and if things go well, can accept. Because the problem of intolerance is not just the problem of majorities dominating minorities, it's also the problem of minorities sometimes acting violently, attacking persons and institutions that they think dominate them. A toleration scheme that is based on fairness and justice is a toleration scheme that we can expect not just of majorities to accept, but also of minorities, because they cannot claim to be treated unjustly. They are treated justly according to norms that respect their freedom and equality. Whether all the violence that we experience in our world will go away, I don't know. But at least we should strive for a scheme of toleration which is mutually justifiable. Thanks for your attention.
Don't go away. So we open up the floor to questions and to comments, and you will see that we have on either side of the room, we have, and I want you to speak into the microphones because this is being recorded. It's very important that we all be able to hear the questions.
It's really a very enjoyable lecture. But I wonder if you would talk about two issues, which is, ultimately isn't the problem with toleration is that there's always a concept of one group having the power over the other, which originates in its monarchical history. And number two, great ideas, but in the real world, where the majority, in a supposedly democratic manner, especially in this country, inflicts tremendous violence on the world. I'd like you to address that. How should minorities then respond to your lovely ideas in reality?
Right, thank you. In a society in which majorities think they are justified in imposing norms on minorities which really are not justifiable between them as equals, a lot depends on the institutional scheme and also on the democratic quality of the public culture, what minorities can appeal to. In many systems, and it's no accident that in the examples I gave you from Germany, it's most often the courts which minorities appeal to and say, and can show, that reciprocity has been violated in imposing certain normative structures on them. Now, in many constitutional societies, this is a possibility, but it is not ideal, because we'd rather have these reflections and voices and contestation and critiques in the legislative process, to have a better voice there than later to stop a legislation with the help of a court. But that's still where the legislative structures do not work that way, do not allow for that kind of reflection, a possibility that if you have a constitutional structure, you can appeal to it. But not in every society that is there, and it doesn't always work. because, you know, the Constitution can be interpreted in this way or that way, and we will see what the American Supreme Court comes up with in terms of an interpretation of equal rights. Plus, the Constitution has to have the right definition and interpretation and article about equal rights in place, such that minorities can appeal to it. That might not always be the case. It is also important that minorities can appeal to a democratic public, that there are media which take their issues seriously and do not depict them in a stereotypical way. That's a struggle, and you just hope that they form alliances of critique and of making their voices heard. But, you know, that's a matter of, to some extent, contingency.